Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome back to Behind the Minbar, Blueprints for a Better Masjid. I don't recall what number episode this is, but this is Uskudar 2.0. This is our second episode, alhamdulillah, intercepting some of the scholarship here that is transiting through Uskudar, Istanbul. Alhamdulillah, we are honored today to have our dear brother Yasin, Dr.to-be Arnold Mol. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Arnold.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So I'm going to keep this extra quick because we have like hours to talk about and only 45 minutes to talk about it without 2x, as I often say. So Arnold Mol is a colleague at Yaqeen Institute. He has some guest submissions for Yaqeen, but he is a professor in the philosophy of religion in Holland, in Leiden University, which is the oldest university in all of Holland.
Yeah, in that way it is. Yeah. So there are some claims, for example, that there were some other institutions that are a bit older, but technically we are the oldest official university.
Okay, mashallah. Yeah. And so philosophy of religion, people should know, is definitely a niche of his that he has specialized in. You can benefit a lot from his publications. And the Human Rights Project in general as well, sociology, anthropology. And I'm putting all of that up front because we're going to talk about, at least directly, none of that right now. It is particularly your training and your teaching of the subject of conversion theory that has me extra excited about today's episode. This is Blueprints for a Better Masjid, and there is so much of the convert experience, even more so than meets the eye when people initially hear the word convert, that I want to unpack here. But before I unpack it, a focus on conversion theory and contemporary religious studies in general, how that can create a better environment in our masajid, that'll be our theme. But I have to step aside and start with the Sunnah. The Sunnah is that the Prophet ﷺ would at times gather the Sahaba and tell Salman al-Farisi, radiallahu anh, tell them your story. Tell them how you got here. And there was, as we all know, so many legs to his journey until finally arriving in Yathrib and then Taiba, Medina. So tell us your story.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So yeah, that, of course, after so many years, more than 2 decades, constantly telling your story always feels a lot of times sort of weird, boring, and also what, especially with the experience of the last 2 decades, is it's more about why I stayed Muslim, not how I became Muslim.
Oh, okay.
Not every convert has like this sexy story, this movie story. Some just simply, oh, I married somebody, or it was a very slow process. For me, it was pretty quick. So everybody has their own version. So I always remind, like the hadith, where people are dragged into Jannah with chains. Like everybody has their own dragging story in that way. So for me, I come from a Catholic background.
In the sense that they feel compelled to be Muslim, not that there was a gunpoint.
But even then, I've started to accept this, by the way. That's something, a lot of converts, especially when they sort of have more this very, I chose to be Muslim type of story, and that sort of, it was a very conscious choice, and sort of, they make that sort of in their, sort of the idealist version of conversion. I remember sitting at a wedding one day, and there was another white man sitting there, and I remember it was time to pray. So I stood up, and he had the full. So he was married to a Suriname Muslim lady. So he was also dressed, as a white guy, dressed full ethnically. He went full in. And I remember it was time to pray, and I stood up, and he caught my hands like, "Oh, you're a real one."
Oh my goodness.
And I was a bit shocked at that time, because I was a couple of years Muslim, and I was a bit like, huh? This was the first time I met somebody like that, that sort of, I became Muslim because of her. And I remember for so long that sort of it felt hypocrite, it felt wrong. But after I'm thinking, a lot of times, a lot of these people, most of them, in the end of life, there is a mustard of faith in them, in a certain way. Because you cannot act out for all those years. You cannot play along. There is a normalization of being Muslim in a certain way.
Yeah.
So I see change.
Sometimes coming for the wrong reasons, or maybe your primary reason is wrong, but still, it's sort of, it's probably, even within the Islamic discourse, and of course you're familiar with this, Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, famously said, and so many of the Salaf have said words to this effect, different packagings of the same sentiment, that I pursued this, he meant sacred knowledge, this scholastic path. he said, I pursued this for other than Allah, and then Allah insisted that it be for nobody but Him.
Yeah.
So basically, I developed my intention en route, or I sort of discovered that it was an inappropriate intention, and it became appropriate later on. And we even, subhanAllah, have, like in the Sahaba, I mean, just to mention that in Abu Talha, when he had proposed to Sulaym, she said, a woman like me would love to have a man like you, or how could a woman like me, deny someone of your status? But you are a mushrik, you're a pagan, and I'm a Muslim woman. And so he went to the Prophet ﷺ, and he became Muslim, and then
it was his mahr.
And she said, if you become Muslim, I will not ask you for any mahr but that. But the Prophet ﷺ said that here is Abu Talha approaching with sort of the light of Islam sort of glimmering from his face. So it was almost like a social element that caused him to, why not look into Islam? Like, look into it for real.
Exactly.
SubhanAllah.
And this is exactly what...
But what made you convert to begin with? I'm going to jump into conversion theory in a second. The bulk of our episode will be about it. People are always excited to know, right? Because sometimes, especially born Muslims, we take it for granted. Sometimes we overcomplicate it. We think this person can never become Muslim, or they need all of this to become Muslim. You saying it was instantaneous in a sense?
No, it was pretty quick.
A lot of it was after.
I never used the term born Muslims. It's raised Muslim in that way. You're raised as a Muslim. And I wasn't raised as a Muslim. I was raised as a Catholic in Holland, Northern European country that's mainly its perspective is very Calvinistic, Protestant Christianity. So even your Catholicism has become sort of very much is in a Protestant way because it filters a bit through it. And so I grew up with the belief in the existence of God was normal for me. So I was brought up with it, I was raised with it, but also it felt normal for me. So for example, the existence of God was never an issue. I had friends who converted to Islam that were atheists, so they had to take on the whole package. For me, so that faith of God being there was always normal. For me, it was more like, where is He? How do I connect with Him? So when, at the time I remember being even, so for example, as a Catholic, you go to catechism, you go to true formation when you're a kid. And I remember I was like 8-year-old standing next to the priest. We had a very good priest, very nice guy, very good with the kids as well, in a good way. And I remember standing in the front of the church, looking at the length of it with all the imagery around it, the crucifixion, everything, in paintings, and then of course the cross itself with the statue hanging on it. And I remember saying to the priest, and I still have it vividly in mind, and him being taller than me, and I was a kid and looking in the big church like...
There was a power dynamic there physically.
Yeah, but then saying, how can Jesus be God if He talks about God as something else than Him? So there was sort of a mantik already, a logic going on in there. And growing up, around the year when I was about 18, I started to read more. So I started to read other religions, on Buddhism, Bhagavad Gita. I started to sort of explore things. And I was studying biochemistry, and one of my fellow classmates suddenly said, hey, we always talked a bit about God and everything. And he suddenly said, can I borrow you my Qur'an translation? And I was like, wow. And it was very weirdly framed as well.
Borrow from you?
Can I borrow you my Qur'an translation?
Meaning lend you, give it to you?
Lend you, yes. And I was like, okay, why? He says, I'm curious how you respond to it. So now of course he always now he claims always like, no, I wanted to convert to Islam, and maybe convert Arnold to Islam, but implicitly that was maybe there. But when I came back to him saying I want to follow this, he was a bit like, why? Huh? What? So he was surprised. In the sense it really cost something. He was also sort of caught off guard by it. So he gave me the next day the Quran translation, Dutch Quran translation.
So he was using you almost like a...
would you believe in it?
A sparring partner for his apologetics.
Yeah.
And you actually sort of, were captivated by it and wanted to follow it.
Yeah. So he gave me Dutch Quran translation, which is not perfect. Again, that's the thing. The ideal Quran translation. I stopped looking at that. The Quran is already so different enough that even the bad translation can still show you the difference of the Quran.
That's crazy. Sheikh, obviously statistically this is the number one reason people become Muslim.
Yeah.
And that used to drive me crazy. Because I used to work for an organization, they used to have this domain, freequran.com, freequran.org was ours. And people would constantly follow up. They'd order a Qur'an, I'd put it in a small envelope, I'd ship it to them, like by order. And they'd always come back and say, like, I want to convert. And I'm always like, because, you know, I'm an Arab, I don't know that much Quranic Arabic at the time, 25 years ago. But I know this translation is like, it's not musical, like you know, rhythmic, melodic. It's definitely not as eloquent. Me as an English speaker, even if I didn't know the source language, like, this is clunky, like, it's stiff. So I can't imagine, what about this? But that is the power of the Qur'an, that even sort of a ballpark translation of a message from God strikes so deeply at the souls. It is incredible. So, and Khattabi, rahimahullah, actually speaks about this, you know, in a sense of being one of the subtle miracles of the Qur'an that many people overlook. And I think now in translation, you can appreciate it more than anything. Everyone, statistically, numbers-wise, data, this is the number one reason. I've read the text myself. What's in there just makes sense. It strikes such a chord that
and different elements,
of course.
But the idea of but the idea of khatiba being addressed, that is one of the unique things about the Quran, is that you feel spoken to. Like for a long time, I never understood. I was 20 years old back at that time, and it was a year after 9/11. So this is September of 2002. At the time in Holland, there was not a direct type of discourse between Islam 9/11. Not yet. That came after there was an assassination in Holland a couple of years later. Then sort of there was already Islamophobia, but then sort of the direct connection between terrorist acts and sort of connecting Islam to it, that came a bit after. So I was in sort of the in-between phase where Islam was still weird and wrong and different, blah blah blah. But it was less sort of it wasn't a full security issue yet.
Right.
And so I started to read that Quran translation, and for like 3 months, and he didn't see anything. And there was this Quran translation with the Arabic in it, next to the Dutch translation. He never said anything about it. He just gave it to me. And the first time I opened it as a Western book, following the English, Dutch. So I was like, and you open up in the index, and I was like, index at the back, you know, in the front. That's weird, you know. So already the book is weird, you know. And then I have to flip it,
and yet it's accessible.
Yes.
How amazing is that?
And I skipped. There was a sort of small introduction to it, but for it, okay, chapter 1, Al-Fatiha, because that's how you read a book. No prepared at all. And then Al-Fatiha is a bit like, okay, that's like a prayer. Okay, and you just go to Al-Baqarah. That's sort of, it's not a book. It's not, you don't read, it's not a story. It is constantly saying to you. So you feel, and that's something I never had with the Bible, never had with the Bhagavad Gita or anything else. It felt like the immanence of God. You know, so the presence of God, him walking, using that language now, that symbolic language, is sort of suddenly him walking into the room. I created you. So sort of that very confronting language. It captured me. And at the time, I was still a street kid. Because that's the thing. Even though you grew up with Catholicism, God is there. You doing good. All that element was I was raised in that, but sort of what do I do in my life was unclear to me from a Catholic upbringing. So at the same time, that element,
the definitive guidance element, actual sort of manual for life, was a big part of it as well.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So the speaking to you in the second person or stimulating you to think about tough questions, the devotional or definitive framework for guidance. You know, I am running the risk right now of undermining the whole theme of the episode because I can literally, I just listened to you all day on this, but can I sort of ask you a follow-up? First time I ever met you, I asked you, when did you convert? And then you said to me, which one? I converted 7 times. And initially I thought you meant till you became Muslim, but then you meant 7 times within Islam.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a journey for another time, and I recommend for our viewers to look them up. They do exist, mashallah. You're interviewed in many different places across Europe and elsewhere, and you have your publications in writing. But after we've sort of flipped the page on this chapter, guidance to the path, even the Qur'an has this, there's guidance then within the path, right? Yeah. And so you've become Muslim, but then within Islam there is sort of phase after phase, even if we're oversimplifying. What did that teach you? Was that before or after you studied conversion theory and really got sort of fascinated by it?
Especially for focus on the theme of this podcast and who we are serving through this podcast, is sort of God is always doing his part, of course, alhamdulillah, but the thing is to sort of him throwing the Quran in my face in that way, using again that symbolic language. You know, then I showed up at the mosque. I want to convert. And the first response was the pharmacy's next door. this is more than 20 years ago, small, working class community, Moroccan community, that was like, what, this white guy walking in, it's like, yeah, the pharmacy's next door, like, I want to convert, and their first response was, why? So they were not used to converts yet. So there you already had a community that was very much...
I don't get it. Like, they assumed you have a drug issue, or what?
No. Pharmacy, like, they thought they're not used to that sort of, that they are used to the fact that only
they thought you were at the wrong address.
Yes, and only only their community walking in.
Okay.
And by the way, I had a drug issue, and the Shahada solved that.
Allahumma lakal hamd. Okay.
So, but that's the thing. You walk in, and they were like, okay, sorry, you're at the wrong address. So the idea is that somebody walks in, and they're like, oh, imagine that. Even if I was at the wrong address, you would drag me in, right? Because Allah's dragging him in through chains.
Yeah.
Using the pharmacy. But instead, we're like, no, get out again and go next door.
So there's a famous story of one of the Salaf, the early great scholars, that he was praying his night prayers, and sort of a neighborhood thief sort of crawled into his window or whatnot to basically rob the house, assuming the house was empty. And so, like, he basically stopped him and prompted him and woke him up to his senses. And then the people see the imam bringing the thief that everyone knows is a thief. He's like a vigilante, apparently, into the masjid for Fajr. And they're like, what are you doing? Like, is everything okay? Like, does he have you sort of hostage? What is it? And he said he came to يَسْرِقَنَا فَسَرَقْنَا. He came to steal from us, so we stole him.
Yeah, exactly.
He came to rob us, and we robbed him.
He still found treasure.
So we robbed him of his former life and gave him an actual treasure.
Yeah, exactly.
So beautiful. Because it's so beautiful. Why? Forgive me for overstating maybe the obvious for some, is that we're not great yet at systematizing our da'wah, and most of our converts, they come to our door. Yeah. And so at the very least, be ready for that.
Exactly.
We need to be more forthright, more
because Allah
outreaching.
Puts the ball in your court now. Because the Qur'an sort of... Imagine also, my classmate was from a Moroccan background. His father came here in the late 1960s, 1970s to Holland. From the northern Morocco villages. And then imagine the Qadr, the line of Qadr.
Yeah.
So the thousands of years preparation, to end up saying, hey, here's the Quran translation. To end up with, because yes, in Northern Europe, converts are new. So Islam is only reaching us now in a way that it not can only convert individuals, which always happened in the past.
Yeah.
Through interaction, traders, ambassadors, Muslim ambassadors coming to Northern Europe, talking with people. We know of converts throughout the last centuries because of that. Interaction with colonialism, etc.
But what's different now?
Exactly. Now you have Muslims living, diaspora Muslims living there in large communities in the West, and thereby converting a lot of people through that interaction. The same thing that in the first converts, really the majority of converts in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, in Holland, Belgium, Germany, etc., were mostly women because they married a Muslim man, and then they were exposed to Islam. So it's not the marriage and anything, but sort of because there were no websites, there was almost no literature. So the only way you could see Islam and experience Islam and know about Islam was a lot of times through relationships. So a lot of women converted. Now, through websites, all the information out there, most people convert outside of that social interaction. But the thing is, and that's what conversion theory helps us in understanding those processes, is that, of course, the iqtida and sort of the theology of it, the qadr element of it, is, of course, you can't plan that. Those chess pieces impossible for us to figure out. Like these are chains of qadr.
That's Allah's master plan. We believe in it.
Exactly.
But there's a plan that we need to sort of.
But then He wants us to show up because now that convert is your amanat. So he's a mawali. Are you the wali? Because Allah is the wali of everybody. But are you technically the ummah, the receiving ummah of that convert is the wali now of that convert? And a lot of times that's still not. It's better now, but compared to 20 years ago, but. It is still not perfect, and not to blame the community, by the way. It's a learning process.
Based on the studies within the domain of conversion theory and sort of the psychology of conviction in general, how big of a factor, where on the totem pole does that desire of belonging play? How much of a factor? Because there's even that debate that human beings are more, consciously or not, prone to emotionally based decisions, emotionality, than rationally based decisions, rationality. And so based on sort of this world of research, how much is belonging important to actually sort of receive someone, as you said, do our part where Allah has sort of sent people our way, and keep people there,
yes.
Right?
So, sort of, if you map it out, so the believing part is, what do you believe in? You believe in Aqidah, you believe in certain creeds, you believe in certain types of history that are real for you. Not simply everybody can believe in the historical existence of our Prophet ﷺ. But for example, the miracle element, that's faith. That's believing. So Islam presents a worldview, a theoretical worldview.
Persuasive, intellectual, theoretical, rational.
Exactly, about events in history, about a worldview, about how metaphysics, how reality is structured. That is the believing part.
Okay.
A lot of converts, for example, a lot of converts enter through the believing part. So for them, sort of the entrance is a cognitive experience. It's a thinking experience, especially with a lot of men. We're stuck in our own bubble, and then sort of we're dragged.
You're going to get in trouble for that line, but we're going to act like you didn't say it.
The thing is that, of course, yes, for women as well, but the thing is that a lot of data show that. That's the thing, the data shows it. So even though we don't like those stereotypes, a lot of data shows is that, and the belonging.
Relatively speaking, the reasons are a little bit leaning on
character-based.
Character-based.
It's character-based, intelligence-based, and of course, so therefore, yes, you have spread out over the two genders, certain characters with certain intelligence that are more faith focused, on a more sort of more interaction focused. But you still, and that's the point.
So cognitive versus community, you're saying?
Yeah, but and socialization.
Socialization.
But the thing is, you need both in the end. So it doesn't. Again, I always say doesn't matter if you enter through the front door or through the window. Doesn't matter. That's not a. So again, that idealist part, I really already had the full worldview. I entered it. No, I still don't. On the parts of it, still don't understand that Arnold had converted. This Arnold is sort of has the whole rational worldview mapped out. I started study Islamic theology, went full into it.
So you believe it's just not honest to say, hey, I made this conscious, purely objective decision that Islam is an absolute truth. And even, it's way more complex than that.
I was still a 20-year-old stoner. But the thing is, it convinced me. And then it was the nice Muslims that made me feel safe.
Okay, we're back on the podcast theme.
Yes, that's the whole point.
We made it back, alhamdulillah.
That's the whole point, is that the belonging itself is the life world. That is how you live that worldview. And that you do with others. So the worldview, you can have it on paper. There are a lot of religions that exist only as a worldview on paper because there's no community anymore living that worldview. So that religion, a lot of those religions are what we call dead religions because there's no life world. People don't live it anymore. But our religion, alhamdulillah, is a worldview that's alive. It is lived by people. But it's a communal religion. So as a convert then, you cannot do it alone. Because even the books that tell you how to pray, imagine, can you really 100% practice the religion purely if you follow the theories? There are so many details of prayer even, or doing washing it, until the elbows. But the way you do it, sort of, I learned not by reading, I learned by seeing and mimicking. So there's already our religion, a large part of it is impossible to do, from my perspective, mainly impossible to do without that socialization. But then also that belonging has to do with, but what is then belonging? Belonging then, of course, in what way is it cultural? In what way is it, of course, language? One of the main problems I had in that beginning was I went to the mosque. Only certain people would know Dutch or English, the languages I knew. And so that already was one of the main problems, is that to belong is simply not to be present, is to interact, to be understood, to understand the other.
So I have two very important questions on this that are very practical for those running our centers, our masajid in Europe and in America. The first of them is that, would you agree then with the theory that for later generations of even people raised Muslim, right? Like born into Muslim families or born to Muslim parents, since their ethnic identity in Europe or in the Americas is becoming a secondary identity, right? Like, I'm not as Egyptian as my parents or Moroccan as my parents. Then in that sense, there is a sort of a dovetailing of the need for belonging. Like, how do we make sure we don't make them choose, hey, are you American or Egyptian? We're not Americans here, or we're not sort of like Dutch here. And then you can actually convert them out of the religion, if you will, if it becomes too heavy of a cultural identity. Do you believe that everyone can really be seen as a convert of sorts because we're all a work in progress?
So
from like a strategic perspective, not theological, of course.
So there are multiple conversion theories, and a lot of this research has been done especially in relation to Christianity and Christians, but they're usable for us as well. But I do hope that more Muslim sociologists and anthropologists understanding the inside of the Islamic worldview also start to engage it more. But I always like the theory of Louis Rambo, where he talks about there are sort of 7 phases, and what he also emphasizes, and they're not sort of very linear, they can be very messy. But he says everybody sort of starts out with their main context. That's how you begin. Same thing for you. You come from an Egyptian family, you grew up in America. And then he says, then you can have sort of a crisis. And crisis is not meant the building's on fire. Crisis is sort of
trying to reconcile.
Worldview and life world doesn't align.
I live like this, but I'm told this.
Yeah, and also that, and especially because if in Muslim majority countries, Islam is lived and mapped out in the mosques, and also as minorities living in, for example, in non-Muslim countries, in the mosque, Islam is sort of mapped out. It makes sense. So you can see there's very clear comparison between a mosque in Turkey or Morocco or Egypt and a mosque, for example, in America or in Holland. But outside of it, it's completely different. Here in Turkey, even this is a secular country, Islam is mapped out outside of it. It's present, it's there. So you are, even if you're not Muslim, implicitly, if you live in Turkey, you eat halal, everything. There's an implicit Muslim life. For us in the West, as Muslim minorities, we have to force ourselves to be Muslim outside of the mosque.
And so to be like very practical in terms of being efficient as masajid at offering landing platforms for our converts. Like on the one side there's the
and reborns.
And reborns, I guess.
Yeah.
So that was the 2 threads. I want to see if I can do one for this and one for that, almost as if like a checklist for people listening on what they can do. For those coming in, they need like a landing site. For their educational, but also their social needs. Like educational, you said you became Muslim, and even the 5 pillars were not sort of there. Oh, I have to pray, I have to fast. So that may not be available in the Jummah khutbah. That may not be available in the nightly khatira, right? It's a given. It's by osmosis. A person picks it up if they've been raised Muslim. Or hanging around for long enough, but we don't want people to sort of wait around.
And
so
mosques treat that as something that's done by the families, like you said.
Right.
You know?
So how to be intentional to create that. And at the same time social support, because Qur'anically speaking, people rush back to God between a rock and a hard place, right? And so we should expect that more often than not always, people will be coming into the faith because Allah blessed them with a hurdle in their life that will, or even a scar or a wound, that will send them looking for healing, and inshallah healing that will not just benefit their worldly stay, but even their akhirah. Like Allah breaks you to build you better, right? And so that means educational and social. We need a landing site front and center ready to receive on those fronts. If you could speak to that, then maybe we can talk about on the other side for after the landing site, for those that are on the fence. You know, many times not everyone there is there. Sometimes people are there until they don't have any more reasons to be there, right? Or they find it unsustainable to be there. And so maybe we start with the converts. Let me tell you the impetus for this question also. One final point, forgive me, is that creating spaces for converts in masajid, I understand it and I do it actually. We have convert care in my masjid to validate their experiences and their unique needs. But also I fear sort of a boundary being created. It's not like an intake method. Like, what does it mean to be like no longer a convert per se, right? What's the graduation point?
I never deconverted. And what I mean by that is not only that I never left Islam, but also, I mean, I'm still after more than 21 years still approached as the convert.
Right.
So you're always othered. So there is sort of a maximum percentage of how much I can belong in the community, because in a way I'm always the other. There are moments where I forget I'm a convert, I'm simply a Muslim. There are moments. And that mainly has to do with when people don't look at me or approach me or talk to me as the convert, but simply as the brother. And a lot of time, and that's also sort of, as convert.
SubhanAllah, there's two ways to look at this, Sheikh, and forgive me again. There's like the badge of honor way to look at this, right? Like the Sahaba were all converts. Even I recall, I'm sorry, I'm going to digress a bit, and I hope it's useful. Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anh, right? Sort of the iconic convert. There's in his biography, you read that him and his brother one time, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, apparently, they went to marry two sisters. And they were introducing themselves, and they said, he said, I am Bilal, and this is my brother. We are two men from Al-Habasha. We are from Ethiopia or Abyssinia, whatnot. We were lost, and Allah guided us. كُنَّا ضَالَّيْنِ فَهَدَانَ اللَّهِ كُنَّا عَبْدَيْنِ فَأَعْتَقَنَ اللَّهِ. And we were two slaves, and Allah emancipated us. فَإِن تُزَوِّجُوا. And if you permit us to marry into your family, فَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ. And if you don't, فَاللَّهُ أَكْبَرُ. It's nice. Like, if you permit, we thank God. If you don't permit, God is greater. Like, he's almost, this is his CV. That, I identify, even Salman al-Farisi we began with, he was called Salman ibn al-Islam. This didn't erase, of course, his ethnic ancestry, but he was known as Salman, the son of Islam. That was his greatest honorific. As opposed to, like you said, otherizing or sort of second-classing within the community, intentionally or not. Like I said, sometimes we offer these services for our converts to validate their unique needs, but it is almost seen as a way to, or it translates at times into them never outgrowing this, he's a beginner. He's still in the kindergarten phase.
Exactly. So I remember talking to a man that converted more than 60 years ago, and he said, I'm still treated as a convert when I walk into a mosque, because I'm one of the only white guys stepping in, so there was like, hey, what are you doing here, etc. He says, you're always treated as the other. So there's also an element to it that, of course, and I always think I've thought a lot about this, like every culture is a convert culture, even though a lot of Muslim cultures forget it, they think as if they've been Muslim always. But I think in every culture is a convert, they had the threshold a moment. And like, so now Northern Europe and America, inshallah, like how would they look at those 500 years from now? When sort of the majority now, or a large part has become Muslim. Like, for example, in Yugoslavia, part is Christian, part is Muslim. And it's normal for them now, even though Bosnia, they started to convert only 500 years ago, or even 300 years ago. So this is now the threshold phase. Mosques should create landing platforms as a threshold phase for converts. But that is sort of part of the, the thing is for a convert itself. So I converted when I was 20. It felt like you're 6 again. So sort of you have to reparent yourself as a Muslim. And you're treated as a child even by the community. And also you're confronted by that when you, for example...
By a well-meaning community.
No, it's not about blaming. It's about seeing it and understanding it. And sometimes you have those moments of resentment. And...
I'll give you an actual story. Like, whoever doesn't hear the rest of this clip needs to stop now. Because unless you hear the full context, it comes off wrong. I, generally speaking, because of just probabilities and likelihoods, not because there's no exceptions to this, there's many exceptions to it, but likelihood, a convert from another religion, that was raised into another religion, I don't necessarily encourage them to marry someone that was born into a Muslim family. And the reason being is that after 20 years of serving the community, I see that a convert married to a convert is more sympathetic to the experiences of the convert, right? What I mean is that, I too have family members that, have this, that, and the third. I too am struggling with how to reconcile how I want to raise my kids with,
but I have footnotes to
whether
that.
It's the alcohol or the tattooism or sort of like the extreme sort of liberal iteration in terms of sexual orientation and otherwise. And I've seen converts actually be more compassionate, more understanding, because they're cut from the same cloth. And so out of fear that the convert will be pushed away from Islam by the intolerance of a person who he doesn't realize, he's never been tested with family members of this sort or a community of that sort, I see it. Like I see that, you know, keeping them not isolated, but sort of bolstering each other.
But at the same time, you have
helpful.
You have Muslim families that are diverse. So I also know, for example, that especially when you have, for example, people coming from sort of more secularized Muslim families, and they sort of start to really practice it, the reborns. And like, yeah, my brother has tattoos, is drinking, this and that. So sometimes also, then it's especially the converse, although she technically comes from, or he or she comes from a Muslim family, that the convert is the one that is exactly the person they need, because that's the one that will not blame her or him.
I've seen that.
Exactly.
And that is why I think oversimplifying into
but it has to do with dealing with diversity.
Dealing with diversity. I think that's a nice, healthy language.
Exactly. Yeah. And to go back to what we were just talking about, the landing platform itself and the othering, there is a type of converts have to accept the fact that you have a before and after, you know it, others feel it or ask you about it, and that is sort of a blessing and a burden, and that's simply life, and you have to accept it. It took me long for me to accept it. For a long time I tried to run away from it. And but you need landing platforms. But it's a landing platform on the top of the building, you know. So you're eventually meant to go into the building, not stay on top of the building. So the idea is, of course, that people are integrated into the community. At the same time,
we need the landing platform, but we have to be very careful as to like locking the door on the roof.
Yeah,
that doesn't allow you into
because
the
you keep people out in the storms and in the wind. And
that's beautiful.
And the thing is, if you go back to conversion theory, and that focuses, of course, on the social and psychological elements of conversion, because we forget it a lot of times. Like, oh, Allah guided you. Yes, but Allah uses a lot of asbab. Because technically, He guided me through a human that gave me something. There's a social element into it. And one of the things that conversion, if you look, for example, using, for example, Rambo, he says there are 7 elements of conversion. So first of all, the starting point, your own context as a pre-convert. Then the crisis, implicit or explicit, that's sort of, like you said, that rock place feeling.
Forces you to choose.
No, forces you to open up. And then you have what we call the quest, the search. You unconsciously or consciously are open towards new ideas. And then you meet something or someone, or both. So I met someone who gave me something, the Qur'an. And that first meetup maybe gets you interested. Hey, I like this. And then we have what we call the phase of interaction, where you test out, is this the thing that solves my crisis? Do I feel alignment? Does it solve my feeling of, that's the thing, now believing and interest in belief becomes, do I belong? This is the interaction. Do I belong in this lifestyle? Is this my life world? And now the ball's in the court of the community.
That's why diversity is needed, more sort of valves for belonging.
No, you cannot force diversity. That simply is there in a community or not. But the thing is,
I'm almost like saying, don't try to fix it. Let it be. It has in Allah's master plan.
Yes, exactly. And so the convert, you have to, as a community, the community has to learn to belong with converts. And the convert has to learn to belong to the community. Yeah. So both have to learn to deal with a new type of diversity. And this is important. And then Luz Rambo says, and then the last phase is the consequential phase. He says, and now you have to learn to live with the consequences of your conversion. And a lot of times, if that starts a new crisis, because that becomes your context again, that's post-conversion. But if that starts a new crisis again, the cycle starts again. Like I said, I had 6 conversions after my main conversion, because I didn't belong to the community. That part had to do with being 20-year-old, being my type of character. Not every community can deal with every type of character. My nickname was the one who asked questions.
Before and after Islam.
Yeah, so and the community could not serve my needs.
I remember hearing you say also, maybe there's just another good example to help people in the masajid understand how people may need different things at different moments.
Yes.
They need a landing site, they need a staircase. They sort of need this
multiple
and that,
floors.
And they'll plug into whatever may work for them. It may not be theoretically the ideal, even theologically the ideal. We have the ideal preserved, but to give people room to grow even, right? Maybe my 20-year-old is not my 40-year-old self, but I think the example I was trying to invoke, I remember you saying that, without a mention of names, that you had chosen a certain order ideologically within Islam to practice spirituality specifically because it was not membership based.
Yeah.
And had you not come from a Catholic background, you would not have been as drawn maybe to an exclusivist sort of member, potentially tribal based system, right? And so that fit you perfectly, and you wanted to drift away from this, and had that been too identical within Islam, maybe it wouldn't have appealed to you.
More than that, I was raised, and a lot of Muslims now in the West are raised like that, through public education, through media influence, everything else. I had a modern and postmodern mindset. A lot of my feelings and my ideas of love and morality and interconnection and tolerance were postmodern. Yeah, so for me, gay marriage, who cares? That type of mindset. And with modernity, miracles cannot happen, because I had this enlightenment approach towards nature and
realistic,
So after my conversion, it took me 10 years to shake off that sort of those elements, that orientations in my worldview. So I had very much, although I was raised Catholic, it didn't emphasize miracles, for example. So reading the Qur'an on the miracles a bit, like I tried to find ways of interpreting in a way that I still felt that it fitted my tendencies. Same thing with a lot of my ideas of tolerance, had to do with that. So it took me about 10 years and sort of going constantly through that cycle again. And that's not always blaming the community. That simply had to do with Arnold and his tendency and his character. And growing up. So it had to do with sort of this is what we call the developmental psychology, is that seeing converts in 2 years, they get it, they normalize into it and done. And I always felt jealous about those, like, why do I have that easy belonging? Well, I sort of constantly are resisting it. But in the end, it made me do philosophy of religion, maybe do this. It forced me into the university to find my way and understand it. And then also meet people that created belonging for me. And one of the things that I love, that sort of Allah blessed me with, next to the Quran, has always been not only general Muslims in communities that created belonging for me, that some of them are still my best friends, simply as common believers, but especially Muslim scholars that sort of, when this sort of arrogant, resisting, asking questions, white guy showed up, and they were like, sit down, hold my hand, and I will be there. That they never resisted. They gave me this feeling of belonging, even though I still had to do a lot of work. So, like I said, you have to reparent yourself. When I converted when I was 20, I became 6 again. So that it took me 10 years to be an adult, in a sense, as a Muslim, is logical. And that's the thing as well, that and because of you're in this sort of desert cycle, and there's a part of conversion. Imagine, I stopped doing drugs, this and this. So the first 2 years are sort of rehab as well. The community has to deal with that as well. You have to deal with a guy or a woman that sometimes they have very hard backgrounds. So you are the rehab center. The rehab center of lifestyles, rehab centers of thinking, rehab centers of eat with your right hand, ethics, etiquette, everything.
Or at the very least, I mean, time is winding down now. I think a good message for us to linger on as communities. I don't want to speak high horse to sort of whoever may be listening and benefiting and is humble enough to indulge me for all these podcasts, but at least the patience and the compassion, the empathy, until other institutions can help, or other social circles can help them, right? Maybe fellow Muslims, not necessarily a masjid program is going to be a rehab center, right? And a reintegration program.
And I overstated a bit, of course.
Of course. I know what you mean in the wider sense. Same way I was trying to widen for our listeners the term convert. By the way, your kids are convert type thing. I want to say that. Also, rehab, I know you meant it in the widest possible conceptualization. Growing up, I remember people were hyper vigilant about tattoos in America, at least in the American Muslim community. I always clocked it that. It was kind of normal for me. I went to public school my whole life, but still in the masjid, people would freak out when someone was with a tattoo. And then one time I just stopped and said, the Prophet ﷺ has a lot of hadith forbidding tattoos. That probably means there was a whole lot of Sahaba who had tattoos. Exactly. It was like a cultural norm. Yeah. And so that means some of them filled the masjid with tattoos.
Because he wanted to stop a living practice.
A living practice. And so for me, it was like, I may have even heard one brother say this to another brother, and he had every right to say, brother, tattoos are haram. And he said something along the lines of, well, this one is going to cost me 6 sessions and $5,000 to laser remove it.
Yeah.
I didn't get a nice, big, sizable budget of money when I took my Shahada to remove my tattoos.
Exactly.
I know tattoos are haram. You're the 1,517th person that has told me this.
Yeah.
And I think that is powerful as well, that this notion that, you said, and I'm going to be like, mess this up, but the tattoos on our lenses, like the stain on our worldview, at times also takes some years.
Yes.
And you can't just snap your fingers. And so to create a sort of a society of understanding. I remember, and I shared this in a previous episode, I entered a masjid that is celebrated in Brooklyn, New York, as being a very youth-centric masjid. And I entered for Taraweeh. I was invited to the masjid, and I got to the masjid. I used to actually serve there years prior in their management. And as I entered, the whole masjid felt like it was people in earrings and tattoos, right? And I was thinking, oh my God, that uncle from my past, or uncles, it's a class of people per se that haven't been exposed to this, so there's a shock element for them. I remember smiling very hard. Like, they're in the masjid.
Exactly.
And they're happy to be here.
Exactly.
And, like, they're probably better than us, and they're clean slate, and they're a work in progress, and so are we. And I think that spirit, along with so much of the theory. Alhamdulillah, we've been discussing a lot of theory and people and some practical advice. I hope the masajid make the best of it. Just to bring it all full circle, that spirit of, do we welcome, I don't want to even say our guests, but the newcomers, right? Give them, a reason to want to land here, right?
Okay, and the thing, and like I said, how we began, the real question is, Arnold, how did you stay Muslim?
Yeah.
And the thing is, this has to do with some of the conversion research shows that of the 100 persons that convert, after 10 years, about half only remain. And there are many reasons.
That's the highest number I've heard on this subject, believe it or not.
Yeah, some of them.
That's great. I hope it's true, but please continue.
Nah, there are some numbers that say 60-40, and by the way, some are, and we still need better research on this. But at least it shows there's also people that phase out,
Correct.
that clock out. And if they look at why, it mainly has to do with I don't feel belonging anymore. It is so hard to hold on to a worldview that when you want to live it, people make it almost impossible for you to feel normal in that life. And like I said, the ball's in the court of the community to keep that going. And a lot of even raised as Muslim that stop practicing, that has to do with them as well. They're chased out of the mosque in that way.
I don't see myself as that person. I don't feel like I fit the mold. I don't belong to that sort of identity that was chosen by the community, you're saying.
Now, or at least sort of, I'm not allowed to be me in a certain way, or they don't sort of allow me to find my way. I'm a messy person. They're all messy person, but they act as if they're not. That type of thing. So, and then again, like I said, apostasy is also conversion. It follows the same rules.
Right.
Context, crisis, quest. So also why a lot of Muslims start to seek other things. A lot of them become postmodern. They are pro certain ideas because they're also formed by the context they're in. What do you do with that? Instead of blaming them for having certain ideas that are maybe postmodern, that go against Islamic ideas, instead of blaming them for them, it's like
the root cause.
Yes, and instead of saying, if you do that, you're wrong. This and that, like, how did you get there? How it became you were socialized into it? Why? Because the majority of them are in a non-Muslim country. You can't blame them for socializing in the majority context because Islam is not a given outside of the mosque.
So this is a subject for another episode. But to conclude, you're saying that in this 7-phase cycle that Rambo puts out, which I haven't read, of course. Sorry, Rambo in the American mindset is...
I know. That's always the fun when I teach it. Like Rambo is a real name.
Okay. Yeah. So in those 7 phases, it would also be true that these people who convert, meaning to apostasy, by the time we notice it, it means we dropped the ball much earlier.
Yes, because you're already at 0.5. Same thing that for parents coming to me.
0.5 is when it surfaces.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's the thing. So you have meetup interactions, and then you have sort of living it. you're doing it. That's called a phase of commitment. So this was where, for example, when women start to wear the hijab, you know, when
it's a later stage.
Yeah, so a lot of times I have parents coming to me like, oh, she suddenly wears hijab. Oh no, that's phase 6. You know, sort of, and when I explain those phases, they're like, oh, and we didn't, also for non-Muslim parents of converts, they're like, oh, we did not allow the space for her to be open about what was happening with her.
And that's why we felt a sense of betrayal when she became Muslim.
Yes. It's like, and I confront him with that, like, what is the thing for, okay, you're scared, a lot of times you're simply scared of losing their kid. And Islam doesn't make you lose your kid. You know, so
and that's super important advice.
That is so important.
And when the community needs to tell them, make sure your parents find you to be better than you ever were before.
Exactly. Retain the belonging with your parents, and that your parents feel you still belong to them.
That's beautiful.
And
that'll help your Islam and even help your parents as well.
And trust me, it's very hard to talk with your parents about your faith because there's this, you know,
just maintain the relationship.
Yeah, tabligh is very difficult in those type of relationships, but still at least make sure that you show you are a better person. It's ihsan.
I feel like we've only sort of caught the tip of the iceberg on this one, and you've really sort of piqued my curiosity in many respects. I'm going to make sure, inshallah, to connect people. Some of these resources you mentioned, I'm going to bother you for them and put them in the description of the video. For everyone else, I hope this was of benefit for you to sort of peer into the mind of not just the convert, but the sort of the archetype of what conversion looks like, and that there's so much more of it than we think. May Allah accept from us, and we want your feedback. I know I've said a few things that were a bit controversial, and Allah knows my intention, and also we're open to corrections.
But also experience confronts us with the non-ideal. So when you say it's controversial, it's like, but this, I saw this in reality. And that's the thing as well, is that we don't like always what we see, but how do we deal with it?
Correct. Yeah, in a perfect world, I would not advise these things. They don't just sound politically incorrect. They sound a little bit painful as well, but I'm trying to offset some very real pains that I felt. Pains that even have pushed people away from Islam. And this is a cliff's edge. This is sort of like Islam and Kufr. This is the most important subject in the universe, or should be. And so throw your comments in. Of course, I'm expecting everyone to be polite, but be also candid, and also any other subjects that we need to unpack, comfortable or uncomfortable. Jazakallah khairan, and may Allah not deprive us of your good work. Keep up the great work, doctor. And I even feel like arrogant saying that, but we look forward to benefiting from you on many different fronts as we have already. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Alaikum salam.